The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're all joining from. Very warm welcome to today's session, a panel discussion on the question, is Agile more relevant now or less? Brought to you by Suf Kanban from Digite. So let's just get ahead and go ahead and get started. The agenda for today's session is that we start with some introductions. I'll give you a quick overview of Digite and our products, just a couple of minutes on that. And then we'll go ahead and get started with the panel discussion on the main topic today. And after that, we will go with a Q&A session. Hopefully, we should have a good bit of participation from all the participants from today. I can still see people joining in, but we'll go ahead and get started. So let me go ahead and introduce today's panelists. Oh, one more thing before I get started. Of course, the panel, the webinar is being recorded, so you will get a link to the recording after we are done with the webinar. Feel free to ask questions anytime during the discussion using the Q&A box, which is on the right hand side of your screens, and we will take as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session today. Looks like there are some questions that are coming up right now. Hopefully, okay, we are good to go. All right. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. So Andreas Bartel. Andreas is a Kanban thought leader, trainer, and coach, and he's the founder of Flow.Hamburg. It's a boutique consulting company based out of Hamburg. He's an accredited Kanban trainer and a Kanban coach. And as he says it on his own profile, he has been helping ordinary people delivering solid products and services in less than 40 hours a week. I really like that because it goes in favor of all the lean agile things that we talk about pulling work and doing work when there is capacity to do work rather than pushing excessive work through the pipeline. Andreas began his professional career at Sun Microsystems, and he's been involved in a variety of different software engagements throughout his career. Because of his love for great software products, he changed his passion and using that to guide organizations to deliver great products and services throughout the world. Predominantly, of course, focused in the German marketplace in a sustainable and humane manner. That's how he puts it. Andreas, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Mahesh.
Yeah, we have Alok Unyal. Alok is Vice President and Head of IT Process Consulting at Infosys Limited. Alok is a seasoned IT professional with rich experience in IT consulting, agile and DevOps, enterprise quality management, IT effectiveness, and efficiency improvement. Um, Given his sort of global and cross-cultural experience around the world and across multiple industries, Alok brings a very strong customer and business-centric thinking and approach towards helping enterprises adopt to new ways of working, driven by design thinking, agile, DevOps, and lean principles, and helping them in being future ready. Alok, a very warm welcome to you as well.
Thank
Um,
you.
then I have Sudit Palahri. Many of you will know him and probably recognize him from other webinars that we do at Digite. Sudi heads our product and engineering organization. Sudi and I have been colleagues and friends for a very long time. He has been in the IT industry for nearly 3 decades now, and brings together a mix of experience across IT services and product companies. One of his main passions is lean and agile transformation, and he's helped multiple organizations, including Digita itself, with their lean agile transformation initiatives. So, welcome, Sudi. And finally, my name is Mahesh Singh. I'm going to be your moderator and the host for today. I've been with Digite since we started way back in 2002 and have gone through multiple ups and downs through our entire company's history. And clearly, we are facing some of the most challenging times right now. Currently, I run the marketing function at Digite. So before I start the panel discussion, just a quick introduction to Digite for those of you who may not know us very well. So we have been a pioneer in web-based collaborative products and solutions for geographically distributed teams for the longest time. Without realizing it, I want to just say a word here. There is such a great focus now on remote work, remote collaboration, and variety of aspects of working remotely. We have been doing this without sort of paying obviously we paid attention to it, but I think this crisis has really uh, made us even more aware of how powerful tools like ours can be. And of course, there are all kinds of companies who also provide similar collaborative solutions. And so I'm really glad that we are able to help in our own way to help remote teams work together. We headquartered in Cupertino, California, right in Apple's backyard. We have about 1 million users around the world, and of course, our focus is in Lean Kanban, Agile, ALM, project portfolio management, etc. And we have multiple products that cover the sort of entire gamut of our agile offerings. So we covers Kanban, Scrum, Safe, whatever be the method or the framework that organizations have adopted. And many of our customers are very large companies. They adopt multiple frameworks, and we are able to support them through our products. Um, we have a very strong visual portfolio management capability that allows you to model portfolios all the way at the top level of the organization down to the team level using a variety of different functions. You can see a hierarchical organization of work that you can do. You can use for multiple contexts, whether it is portfolio management or program management or other types of hierarchies. We have a very strong risk management capability that comes with our enterprise services planning module, and along with that, uh, forecasting and using of statistical models, including Monte Carlo simulation, for helping teams be more predictable and be more reliable in their forecasts that they make about their work and their performance goals that they set. We provide all kinds of other, sort of tooling to help remote teams collaborate with each other, including things such as the dependency management, which is critical for a lot of teams that are working in multiple locations across multiple parts of an engagement. We have very rich analytics and measurements that help teams continuously improve and measure themselves in terms of being able to understand their overall capability and their ability to meet the demands that are placed on them. Uh, and just finally, this last slide here to give you just an idea that we have a fairly wide range of customers, and uh, obviously from very small companies, some very large companies that use our products around the world. So with that, let me go ahead and open up the panel. So like I was saying, we have this crisis in front of us, and the idea of this panel discussion began from observing some of the responses that different countries were demonstrating, different governments and different heads of governments were demonstrating, and it made us think that it could potentially be applied to the uh, organizational model where either you have a very command and control culture where everything is sort of driven from the top, to something which is very federated and collaborative where there is a sort of sharing of power between the central authority and the different business organizations of different states and a country, and there is probably something which is a hybrid of the two, which is the hybrid agile model, so to speak. So, given that, we started to discuss this further to say, hey, how do we, really apply some of the concept that we operate in the business world, in the lean and agile transformation world, and so we put this panel together. And so, let me get started with the first question of the panel and put this to the panelists for today's session. So the first one is very high level. I want all of you on the panel to sort of just share your experience in terms of looking at the countries, governments, and communities. If you look at a high level, people around you or organizations around you, not companies, but these sort of governmental and non-governmental organizations, which have been the most effective in handling this crisis. What are your observations? So, Andreas, maybe since you appear to the leftmost in my panel, I'll start with you. It's easy to remember that. So, Andreas, go ahead.
Thank you. That's, I think, very interesting, intriguing question. So to begin with, I'd like to start with an observation. I read in the media that especially female leaders or countries with female leaders seem to go really well in the time of crisis. And just to name a few, like New Zealand or Taiwan and also Germany, um, seem to get out really well. I would not call it good or well, but better than others, at least. And it seems that with female leaders, we have attributes like more empathy, openness, and especially honesty, maybe paired with some thoughtful but decisive and action-oriented behavior that leads to proper decisions, I guess, in appropriate amount of reducing maybe freedom, while being really thoughtful in terms of what to do, what not to do, and potentially move aside any egos and any populistic discussions and be really focused on the data. And then I need to appreciate my own chancellor, Angela Merkel, who one of the few who actually understands the math behind the curves. And I think that's a huge advantage of being in times of crisis and uncertainty, being honest, but on the same time being action oriented and decisive, and take the necessary steps to act quickly, without paying too much attention on the politics and maybe elections or whatsoever. So to me, it's extremely interesting that the female leadership around the globe turned out to be really robust or resilient in the times of crisis, because of openness and honesty, and looking at the numbers and talking at the real numbers and not hiding information from people, and also being action oriented and take the necessary decision, even if they're not popular, right? So not every decision in Germany is really popular. We're stuck at home, businesses are closed down, a lot of people are suffering, but it seems to be a necessary step. And I think for the sake of health and security, while being honest and open, people are more willing to give up a piece of freedom, right, just for the sake to save lives. And I think that's, it seems, at least my observation, it turns out quite well in times of current crisis.
Great observations, and yes, great point about female leadership. I think there have been some social media messages going around to point to that, and I think it's very well put. Alok, how about you?
Yeah, Mahesh, so I think it's a very interesting question, and over the last few weeks, I've also been trying to analyze, right, which countries have really taken very timely action and been able to flatten the curve. And what really caught my notice was what South Korea did. Now, South Korea was one of the first countries, probably close to the epicenter, and the first one to report the cases. And the first case was reported way back in Jan, and today they're still under 11,000. So they've truly flattened the curve, right? Literally. And what really caught my attention is some of the specific actions they took. So, for example, when the very first case was announced, within 1 week they ordered mass production of test kits in the factories. Right now, I think that's again a great example of being agile, right? And I would say that agile leadership quickly took action, and obviously they also brought to bear the learnings from their past experiences, SARS, etc. So that was the first one. The second thing which they did was, so they actually adopted a very all-inclusive kind of an approach, a very collaborative approach, where the ministries, along with the representation from the regional government and the city level governments, they kind of put a task force together, so which was cutting across these different levels of the government. And they really fostered an environment of collaboration and coordination across these regional boundaries, because that's another thing which we have seen of late, right? So a lot of, even within a country, a lot of interstate kind of dynamics, etc. So that is the second thing which I thought they did very well. The third thing, and that's something which Andreas also alluded, they, right from day one, they ensured that they secure the trust of the people. They made the entire thing very transparent in terms of how the virus was evolving, the number of cases, etc. So they made it a very transparent, open communication, which I think helped a lot. And what I see a lot of countries following that, right? The fourth and the last thing, I think, obviously, they've leveraged the technology very well. They did extensive contact tracing, and I'm sure all of us are by now familiar with this patient 31, which the South Koreans quote a lot, because that was a super spreader, and they really did extensive contact tracing, leveraging data from the surveillance cameras, the cell phones, and the credit card transactions. So I think that has really helped them a lot, and no wonder they've been able to actually flatten the curve without going into a lockdown.
Awesome. So demonstration of agility in terms of production, cross-functional leadership, trust and transparency and openness, and of course leveraging technology. So all of them great points about the way that they handled it and what has kind of struck out for you. I know, Sudhi, we are supposed to kind of do this a little differently, but let me go ahead and pull you in also. Uh, in addition to what Alok said, any observations about India or other places?
So, I think one of the critical questions that most countries and administrations are trying to figure out is how to balance between the lives versus the livelihood question, right? And clearly, it seems like South Korea has been able to get that balance very well. India has taken clearly and kind of a position that lives are more important than livelihood, and we see in the media that even states which are now officially COVID free are still asking for further extension just to make sure that it completely gets taken out. And perhaps the US is on the other side, where perhaps they have kept it a lot more open, let organizations function the way they can, and try to make sure that the livelihood survives. It's also going to be important for us to figure out how, as we come out of this phase, how this whole livelihood question again gets factored in. How soon are we able to get the cycles of the economic going in? And I think that would be an overall factor in terms of how we come out of this overall crisis. Today, it is definitely the health and the loss of and the loss of lives that is part of the dominant media interaction and the social community. But I suspect that very soon it will become in terms of how do we sustain the economy, the poor sections of the society, people who have lost their jobs. How do they feed themselves? What kind of machinery the government puts in place? So I think that cycle of the equation is still got to be tested. It's still very pretty early days, and 2 years hence, after this crisis, when we look at it, I think we will be looking at both these aspects with equal significance to understand, did we take the right approach, how did we come out it, and what we could have done better.
Yeah, very valid point. And of course, that has been the big debate, the life versus livelihood part. I mean, one thing that probably we could have started off with was the fact that perhaps this webinar is a little early in that sense, or this panel discussion is a little early. We still, although what we know, we can tell what is effective based on what we are seeing right now, but ultimately, how do we deal with both the health crisis as well as the economic crisis, and what becomes the most sort of best way to manage it, optimized way to manage it, would ultimately be the most would be considered the most effective, I suppose. Just a little bit upon on the US side. So US, as obviously everybody's eyes are on US, and especially our very visible leadership at the top, as well as, of course, some of the state level leadership. That it has definitely been a uh, what can possibly call in the U.S. parlance a cowboy approach, right? Each to his own, so to speak, in a way, both in terms of just getting organized to provide a proper response, uh, to sort of stick to a consistent approach and not change that on a regular basis, and to provide a overall framework under which all the various stakeholders can operate. So it's been a fascinating and sometimes very worrisome thing to observe. And of course, in the meantime, US has exceeded all other countries in terms of the total number of cases as well as the total number of deaths. So um, of course, it can't be a direct comparison. It's very apples to oranges because of just the different nature of the different countries and their economies and their population densities and so forth. But certainly, there is a lot that a lot of Americans feel could have been done better in the way that we managed it. One example that I want to mention is, and I'm particularly proud of that because I'm part of that, which is the first county or the first set of counties that started the whole response to the uh, COVID crisis in the US is the Bay Area counties, which is where I'm based, and Santa Clara County in particular, which has got the highest number of cases within the Bay Area. That they were the first to actually declare the lockdown and have stuck to it with a very consistent message of saying, hey, what are the indicators that we are observing? And based on those indicators alone, based on science and data alone, we will make the appropriate decisions, not politics, not any other factors. And similarly, it has come across in California. The California governor has been very effective in the way that he's sort of gone about it. California uh, has been touted as an example all over the US and certainly and probably around outside of the US as well. So hopefully it is working in terms of flattening the overall curve. The numbers still go up, but hopefully the rates are much lower than what they could have been otherwise. And of course, on the other side, we have New York, where the numbers have been astronomical. And I think partly because of the disconnect between the New York governor and the New York city mayor, because of which the shutdown did not happen for the longest time. And there was a little bit of let's say disconnect at the state and the city level, because of which at least partly because of which there has been a greater amount of damage there. So uh, so it's been definitely fascinating to see the different federal I mean at the different levels, federal, states, and every state also doing their own thing pretty much, making their own decision, and the communication from the top being very uh, many at oftentimes many very disorganized in the way it came across in terms of giving direction. Great. So uh, just wanted to keep things going. We are about 15 minutes into the panel. I want to make sure that uh, we continue the discussion. I had a couple of slides here that shows, and I won't take time on it right now, but a couple of very interesting slides that I found on how countries responded after the initial onset in Wuhan, and the amount of time they had to respond to it, and what are the various actions we took. Again, won't go through the details of that. And then just a sort of rough translation of that into the kind of impact it has had in terms of the number of confirmed deaths that have happened because of this, and how often they have, how many days have they doubled. So starting from death doubling every day to death doubling in after many weeks or many days, you can see that different countries have done differently. And there's a red curve here is the United States. I think Germany is the one that is right below Belgium. India is here, and of course there are different countries like South Korea and of course China that completely flattened its curve after the initial spurt of deaths there. Um, anyway, so let's go on to that. So again, keeping on that theme a little bit, in addition to what we have sort of talked at a high level of specific examples, are there other good examples and bad examples of agility and adaptability that you have seen in the COVID crisis? So again, maybe Andres, will start with you.
Right. So interestingly, I have some good examples as from Germany, especially the digitalization in school and teaching, which has been well, not doing quite well the last decade. And interestingly, since the crisis, which seemed to provide an appropriate stressor for the governments and for the education sector, it's been interesting to watch that suddenly teachers are exploring tools like Zoom and taking initiative and inviting kids to video sessions. And it seems that the educational sector has been boosted by the crisis in terms of digitalization and adapting to the new circumstances of everyone has an iPad or video cameras, and providing content for education in a digital way, which has been a struggle, at least in Germany, for many years due to budget cuts, bad equipment. And to me, the important message is here that in times of in times of crisis, the necessary stressors seem to at least trigger a right amount of change in some domains where governments and organizations have been struggling for many years. And potentially another example, I heard that Ferrari swooped in and started producing masks for Italy, which hasn't been doing really well in the crisis. And one of the largest European airlines, like Lufthansa, is still struggling in the crisis. However, in the midst of decreasing numbers of passengers, they switched to transport goods, basically, or medical equipment across the globe. For good or bad reason, doesn't matter, but it seems that in times of crisis, those companies who can adapt quickly seem to do better than others. However, in terms of Lufthansa, at least it's not really clear, because as I heard that 95 to 98% of the traffic has been basically extinguished within a couple of weeks. So if we talk about agility, as you have on your slide, I think that adaptability is one of the important key elements, and along with capability, so the capacity, experience, and the skills, and also the frequency of decision making, which would be a good sign. However, maybe on the negative side, I see like panic, right? Hasty decision making, layoff of a lot of staff, especially in the IT industry, just to probably having the difficulty of losing capacity and capability in your key areas of your organization. So again, so this reminded me kind of the 9/11 crisis. So what kind of decision making or situation you're in, and I think it's important to understand that if you think of the Canadian framework, right, and we are currently somewhere in complex and maybe chaotic areas, so it is required to have a different style of decision making. But we are now, I guess, in crisis mode, right? And we have, to remember that sooner or later we are going to get back to normal mode, and we would need to swing back to a different decision-making style, right? And not keep this command and control style of decision and delegation potentially, right? So I think there are good and bad examples currently in the industry, and I guess only time will tell if the amount of decisiveness has been enough, or maybe not too much, within the 6 to 12 months in the future.
Excellent points. Alok, how about you?
Yeah, so just taking off on some of the points which Andrea just mentioned. So I think in general, large enterprises have been pretty quick to adapt to this new normal, as I would put it, right? I mean, it has not been easy. Just imagine enabling thousands of your employees, enabling them to work from home, the entire infrastructure scaling up to meet the demands of the additional stress that it puts on your infrastructure services. At the same time, ensuring that you are engaging with your employees as well as with your customers, right? And trying to make sure that ensure their well-being. So I think in general, enterprises have been quick to respond and embrace this new normal of working remotely. Now, in that context, what I find that enterprises who were already kind of working in this whole agile mode, who had this initiative going on within their enterprises of agility across their ecosystem, they have definitely responded better. So that I would put as a good example. So because they already had the necessary infrastructure in place. More importantly, the mindset was there. The mindset to take quick decisions, to pivot when when suddenly you're faced with an uncertain situation, because that's what agile teams are, right? Where there is uncertainty, there is ambiguity. How do you really pivot and do course correction? So I think the teams have been able to do well. And also, because the whole agile way of working requires breaking down work into smaller chunks and delivering, that has also helped enterprises a lot who are working in that model, because they were able to make course corrections and adjustments easily. I also find that enterprises which had a good cloud strategy in place and they had already cloud enabled their organization, they had moved workloads to cloud. Definitely, they must be faring well. And again, I don't have specific examples, but based on whatever I've seen so far,
Correct.
I know that they've been able to deal with this situation better. So yeah, I think that's what I would put it. And of course, there would always be bad examples as well, in terms of knee-jerk reaction, suddenly putting things on hold. There are a lot of organizations still, for them, the whole idea of people working remotely in a distributed fashion is very alien, right? So they found it very hard to come to, and their immediate reaction was to, no, everything we have to put on hold. But interestingly, I found that a couple of weeks later, they also started slowly gearing up to this idea and be more open to it.
I liked Andres's term there, that you need enough of a stressor, and then it causes the behavior change that you've been looking for all along. But it required the right level of stress to make it happen. Sudhi, what about you?
So I have been very impressed with with at least our government, with the Indian government, and how they have responded. I think within enterprises there's always a structure and there's some leadership, and once the leadership recognizes what they need to do, it can be done fast. But the way that I think the governments in India have collaborated has been pretty amazing. I think for the most part, people who are familiar know that the central and state leaderships are often at odds with one another, keeping going behind one another. But this has been an exemplary example of a collaboration, taking decisions together, making sure that it gets executed right at the district and the police station level. And innovation examples. I mean, converting train coaches into isolation wards, inserting 15-second audio clips into your phone every time you make a call, so that you can spread the word around. Apps from state governments that are actually doing contact tracing right up to the district level and to the local cell tower level, to the mobile phone cell tower level. So I think I've been very impressed with how the governments have actually come together in order to make it all happen. And obviously, we have seen a lot of volunteer groups springing along, but I think the government level of innovation and how they've responded, tracing people, stamping people who are supposed to be under self quarantine for a defined period of time, reaching out to their houses and actually physically stamping them. That was pretty amazing for me. I really did not expect that from at least our government. Not sure.
No, in fact, I was looking up how technology solutions are being applied to this crisis, and I found that India was the one country which had launched 11 apps, and every single of one of them by some government agency. I was quite
Right.
surprised, very pleasantly surprised that they had actually done this. I don't know how accurate and how effective, and of course they will all have their teething troubles, but at least the fact that they were able to put out something quickly and at different levels, right from the top to the city level, was very impressive.
Extremely fast. In the state of Madhya Pradesh, where I saw the app and I had some government contacts there, they had launched their app within 3 days of a lockdown, and pretty impressive app with all the capabilities of contact tracing, knowing who's stepping out of the house, not stepping out of the house. In 3 days of the lockdown, that was like absolutely mind-boggling for me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you guys have shared all the sort of government and corporate examples. I want to share something which is very, and I think partly you alluded to it, Suri, but I was really touched by, especially given the chaos that it seemed to be in US for weeks and end, to see some of the self-organization that we saw at the local level, neighborhoods and local stores, etc.
Yeah.
So people simply deciding that, okay, in a neighborhood all the elderly people must not go out, and I think this happened in India as well. I heard examples of that. So they
Yes.
would simply go knock at these people's doors and say, okay, what all the shopping do you need to do, we will do it for you. Or you go to a local Target store, which is a big corporate. I'm sure they're given lots of direction to their employees and stores, but still, somebody at a store manager or a floor employee level decides that every morning they're going to stand outside, and when the queue forms, they're going to tell people in the queue what is available, what is not available, so that if you don't have what you need, if the store doesn't have what you need, you might as well not stand in the queue and not wait till the end. So amazing examples of little small, at the smallest level, self-organization by, and of course lots of charitable organizations doing feeding the homeless. We have donated to a charitable charity organization locally here that's donating mobile solar panels, because the homeless people in the Bay Area in particular, they typically, everybody has a cell phone here, because if you want to get access to essential services, then you need to have at least a cell phone, so you can get a text message or a WhatsApp message or whatever. Now these poor people, because they are homeless, they don't have anywhere to go. When you say shelter at home, where do the homeless go, right? So typically what they do is, in the daytime, they will hang around outside of a Starbucks and plug in their phone and charge them, either a Starbucks or a parking lot or some place where there is an electrical connection. But now with all these places closed, so these guys are donating solar panels, which are mobile portable solar panels, that so that these people can charge their cell phones. And not just food, but also some technology help them stay connected and
Right.
to be able to get essential messages. So yeah, so just amazing examples, and of course, obviously there are, like you said, overreactions, panics, and layoffs, etc. Clearly, there is going to be a lot of economic stress in the system for quite some time to come, and we'll see how these decisions that the companies are taking will impact them in the in the sort of at least the medium term, and certainly the long term. All right. So we're kind of a little bit over half an hour of discussion. Let's keep going. So given all of this, I guess the key thing that ultimately we are all in the corporate world, in the IT field, etc. What are the takeaways for enterprises, and how do we respond to these, and what are some of the key attributes that can be considered to be contributing towards agility? So let me start this time with you, Alok. You are part of one of the largest companies out of India. You got Infosys got its own unique challenges at scale. So what have you seen? What have you done personally? If you can share any of that, be good to hear from you.
I think for me, the critical success factor, the key takeaway has been, the ability to respond quickly and at various levels, right? So this is the time where, it demonstrates how responsive the leadership is, responsive in terms of appreciating the situation, how it's evolving, doing some scenario planning as to what may happen, because again, we are dealing with uncertainty. We really don't know what's going to happen next. And amongst all this, being able to quickly take actions, to make sure that the business operations do not get disrupted. And this is exactly what I saw, even in Infosys, for example. We were very quick to, get people enabled, working from home, again, at scale, right? And you're talking about, more than 120, 130,000 people being enabled. So I think it was a great example of how, leadership quickly came together, took quick action, and just started acting on it, rather than, taking a wait and watch kind of an approach. So that, I think, to me, was very important. This was also a time where how well you engage with your employees or with your people became very critical, because the whole empathy element was critical in this whole thing, right? So while we serve customers and we want to minimize disruption to business operations, but I think most of the enterprises, the first and foremost concern in their mind was the well-being of and safety of their people. So a number of measures were rolled out to ensure that that's taken care of first. So I think that was extremely critical. Then we get into some of the specifics of, how do you really scale up your infrastructure? And I alluded to that earlier, because that is being tested at these times, right? I mean, how do you really enable infrastructure for remote way of working? So that, I think, again, has been a key element. Uh, Cyber security. So I'm sure all of us have been reading about it, right? So this is also an area where a lot of enterprises have been very concerned in terms of what vulnerabilities are getting exposed when everybody's working, from home, and they're accessing mission critical applications and systems. So again, I think key takeaway for enterprises has been, so whosoever had a good cyber security strategy in place, had tested out all the vulnerabilities, I think they have been successful so far, right? So I think that to me is going to be, will continue to be an extremely important element as we, deal with this situation in future as well. Last but not the least, what I've my personal reading based not just from an Infosys experience perspective, but also what I've seen with some of our large clients is what I alluded earlier, that whosoever already had this agile mindset in the organization and the whole teams were organized like that, they were able to adapt to this very quickly, right? Whosoever had a high level of automation in the way they develop software, so I'm just talking more from an IT industry perspective, where they had a good CI/CD infrastructure in place, probably on cloud. I think they were able to quickly switch gears and be able to run their operations in a very seamless fashion, right? So those are some of the things that stand out for me, Mahesh, if I look back in the last couple of weeks.
Perfect. So certainly, from an overall perspective, from what I hear you saying, agile mindset and culture and technology preparedness, whether it is cloud or DevOps or cybersecurity, etc. I think all absolutely valid points currently, especially in the current technology-driven environment. Sudhi, how about you? What are you seeing?
So I think going beyond what Alok said, and we were one of the, I would guess, better examples of having pretty high level of automation in our software lifecycle. But I think for the small and medium enterprises like ourselves, I think one of the most critical things that we learned or have realized is the importance of having your cash flow in the pipeline, and making sure that you have enough cash to be able to go through a crisis for a year plus in case such an eventuality happens. We were fortunate enough to be in that good position, but I'm sure many aren't, and I'm sure they'll be struggling right now in terms of how to make their ends meet. So I think at least for small and medium enterprises, maybe may not be so much for the for the large enterprises, but for organizations of our scale and size, to have cash flow and reserves that can take you through a deep crisis like this is absolutely paramount. And I think often we tend to kind of take it as assume it that this is going to carry on, and you can keep investing in the business, losing sight of the fact of how important such a crisis can be. I think the other thing that I want to that comes to me is the willingness to be able to throw the rule book. And I think again Alok referred to the point that yes, agile organizations might be enabled in that to a large extent, but though we were agile as a product company, we were always extremely protective of our own IP, and therefore we were always very concerned about, hey, what would happen if we allow mass scale work from home? Would there, what is the impact of intellectual property that you're creating? And clearly what we have had to do was to throw the rule book out and say, okay, if this is the stress, as Andrea said, if this is the stress, how do we respond to it? And what is the additional protection that we need to put in place to make sure that we are reasonably well de-risked? So I think the willingness and the ability to throw out all the preconceived notions, I think that is also pretty critical. Beyond that, I think something that has helped us specifically, and I think to a large extent again comes from our agile thinking, is that because we were always organized into fairly team level autonomy already being practiced, I think we were able to largely respond to it. And I think that would go a long way to any organization that would have practiced it that way. Instead of large HR driven or large centralized decision making, I think if you had teams which were pretty autonomous and had the working relationship between themselves of how they can operate, I think those kind of organizations would definitely find it a lot easier to get along in these kind of situations.
All right, Andreas.
Yeah, just potentially to add a little bit to the all good points Alok and Sudhi have made already. I would like to pick a leadership maturity as a key critical point in the crisis, and maybe especially from my area here, take a historic event by the former German Chancellor and the mayor of Hamburg, Helmut Schmidt, who during the flood crisis, I think it was the 60s, has made quick decisions. He was really action-oriented, and he, for good or for worse, he did not invite the potential people. What he said in an interview, that would make, or whether it would cause delays in decision making. And I think that's like a critical point if you want to build a resilient organization, which is now like a key and survive through the crisis, is a requirement that the leadership at all levels, you make quick and decision and act upon the decisions, and especially in this crisis time. And I was reflecting, so a good point, I think, I know Alok or Zudi mentioned, like Zudi, was it a solid financial or economic performance of a company? If you speak in terms of Kanban or maturity levels of organizations, and that you can, survive in particular amount of time going through a dip. And I think what would be important that would be one key element, so leadership to lead the organizations at all levels through the economic crisis, and having also something on the side to survive this. And I think important in the future will be, if we assume things won't be the same again, and customer taste may change, customer preference will change, I think those companies will have good chances of survive, who will regain customer intimacy quickly again after the crisis. And those who have like trained their muscles, their organizational management systems, right, to quickly adapt to new situations, the frequency of change opportunities, to a capability to drive the change, those will survive. And I think the key element here is a decisive and action-oriented leadership, who doesn't panic, right? Who make viable and proper economic decisions in crisis, to spend the budget at the right amount, in the right areas especially. And it may lead many companies to the necessity of to reinvent themselves, because businesses won't potentially stay the same. And I think this is one of the critical points, especially what we can learn from the crisis, that all the issues you already had now surfacing through the crisis, and all the stressors will, like a climate change, right, that has a huge impact on nature, but in a larger time scale. Now it's like a kind of condensed crisis in a really short period. And it also has the opportunity to show you your weaknesses, to expose you to your weaknesses. And agility means to me to adapt and re-involve your organization quickly in this crisis times, that you can get out of it maybe with taking a punch, but you eventually don't go extinct, right? And to me, leadership maturity is one of the key elements here, because management and corporate decision making is a key. If you're under stress, like I mentioned before, if you think of the Canadian framework, there is no time to discuss a lot, right? You need to act and then see what happens potentially, right? And I think this is a time where decisive management and leadership structures, and also coherence across the whole organization. Again, taking an example from German government, I think we are doing quite well, but now some issues surfacing with the federal structure. Why? Because we have 16 states, and get agreement and make decisions quickly is not easy, right? So having an organization where action-oriented, decisive management, and at the same time coherence of acting across the whole organization. So you follow a specific path altogether. I think that's like the key elements to take maybe some damage, but actually to survive through the crisis.
Absolutely. But as you said, take decision and see what happens, but as long as you don't cause panic or confusion. So there have been enough um, excitement and confusion and criticism of some of the things that people have said, whether it is to do with eating specific medicines, which may or may not have been proven, to eating chemicals, which
So
certainly were not
my
proven to.
assumption is you do like you have a healthy state of common human understanding and
Yes.
sense that you don't do such decisions. That's true. And specifically data, right? What I
Yes.
mentioned at the beginning, honesty, use the scientific method in the data, and try to avoid any system one reaction in terms of decision making, right?
Right. So we are as usual running lightly behind. So here's what I'm going to do. We had a couple of other questions, which at least partly have been addressed by your responses so far. So I'm going to throw those questions open. At the same time, I'm going to invite the audience to pose your questions to the panel. Use the Q&A box on the right hand side, and get in your questions, and we will try and take those questions as best as possible. In the meantime, Alok, Sudhi, Andreas, here are the questions that we had. And what I'd like to do is if you can take these, and if you haven't yet, said something that you were going to, if you have any closing thoughts on the panel today, let's take those questions. Or let's take those responses. So what we were discussing was, okay, so by the way, I had a slide here about what are the different range of actions that companies have taken across different, aspects of responses, right? From worker safety to layoffs to providing sick leave to hours of operation to customer care. So I really like this slide because it shows you what a wide range of possibilities there is for companies and organizations and governments to react, and what a complex task it is, right? Because you got to think of all of these and more probably. So I really like this slide. I thought we'd share this. But anyway, so um, Sudhi referred to this, and when we began to plan this panel, we were discussing, hey, is this a typical disaster recovery kind of a situation? Because most disaster recovery and any kind of downtime type of situations in the corporate world, typically there is or even in the federal world where there is an emergency management system, there is always a playbook, and there is always a set of things that you can follow. I think with this emergency, clearly it has been the case that nobody was prepared for it. But the question is, can anybody be prepared for it? Was anybody prepared for it? That was one question. The other thing that we wanted to sort of finally, identify maybe top two or three critical success factors that were, effective in a successful response. I think if we can take these two questions together, and I would say put your closing thoughts together, that'd be great. So I'll, maybe Alok, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think the in terms of I'll just take the second one what you said, right? I mean,
Sure.
can you just go back to the slides where
Yeah.
you had the questions? Yeah. So I think the most common key factor, I think all of us kind of talked about that. To me, it comes about the agility in response, and that goes back to the agile mindset, right from a leadership level to the up to your team level, because everyone has to respond at their own level. I think that to me is very critical. And as what Andrea said earlier, that command and control model will not work in this situation. So there has to be decentralized decision making, and people should be able to make informed decision. The second second common key factor I would say is going by data and science, right? And that's something which has really struck me, and it has stood out, that how suddenly, whether you talk about politicians, government, corporates, everyone is talking just based on data, right? And decision is based on facts and figures and not on rhetoric. So for me, those two really kind of stood out.
Perfect. Andreas.
Yeah, looking at the question that just popped up in my head. So I think what the key elements, at least here in the Germany, so I think the investment that we had made in the past. So just to give you a picture, what the investment might be in our health structures. So if you're a usual average worker, or you're an entrepreneur, or you run your own small business, you can imagine that your monthly payment for your health insurance goes around like €1,000, right? And I think finally you see the payoff in a proper structured and prepared healthy health infrastructure that kicks in now in Germany. So we hadn't have any big troubles with not enough beds for really those who will need it. And it seems that we Germans complain a lot about the health system, right? It costs a lot of money. And however, in times of crisis, and it turns out that we don't have so much trouble in coping with that. So boiling down to corporate world, I think in maybe some or maybe even many organizations have missed the opportunity to invest in something which was not urgent in the past.
You're right.
And maybe acting more in a tactical, less than a strategic level, and miss the opportunity to put investments in areas which obviously nowadays are underdeveloped, I would say. And I think in terms of portfolios, the crisis is revealing that you have been balancing your budget and investments, potentially not for survivability, but for short-term profits. And I think those companies will go out of the crisis best, who've been thinking about potential. I mean, this is not something specific you can plan for, but as you said, you can have at least some sort of playbook and some resilience at some level. However, you need to invest in some form in your capability of coping with whatever comes around. And I think this is a time to rethink in the corporate or world, what we need to do to survive in the long run, right? Not only like opportunistic investments in action and decision making, and maybe areas you've been neglecting for the past 10 years, being a government or organization, now become evident that these are your, these pose threats to your organization. So this is kind of my takeaway from this.
Perfect. So just to kind of put a Kanban twist to it, so investing in the intangibles is what I kind of heard you say, because the more you ignore the intangibles, the more you are likely to be caught unprepared when something strikes.
Exactly.
Sudhi, your final thoughts, and then let's take some questions from the audience. We have a bunch of them.
So I'll just add one point. I think, you should not lose a crisis and let it go waste. I mean, we need to, every organization, every team, every system has its set of inefficiencies that creep over a period of time, right? I mean, you can easily save at least 20 to 40% inefficiency that creeps over time. And I think we must use this crisis as an opportunity to relook at some of the processes that we have and challenge them and say, hey, do I need this step? Can I take it away? Can I refactor it in a different way? How can I make it more efficient? So I think that is one thing, and extending that to the Agile community, to the Lean Agile community. I think the Lean Agile community was extremely gung-ho about face-to-face interactions versus distributed teams and how they work. While they accepted that yes, distributed Agile is a reality, but it was right from the Agile principles, it was very clear and very strongly communicated that face-to-face interactions is going to be the essential for success. Guess what? That's going to be turned around completely 180 degrees, and therefore, and I think we now hear enough number of examples of IT organizations which are primarily going to go and adopt work from home. And if that is the case, then clearly a lot of what we have communicated in our community so far around how to do ceremonies, what are the best practices, how to be able to refactor some of it, will need to continuously keep adapting, will need to be rethought. Simple example, we know lots of teams have survived on physical Kanban boards. How do they now quickly jump onto electronic Kanban boards and get used to the fact of not being able to move a physical post-it, but being able to move a card on a board and have the kind of interaction and the conversation they were having still on in front of a physical Kanban board. So I think in the agile community, we need to be able to reinvent ourselves a lot from this, at least this one principle where that would, and assume that work from home, remote distributed um, way would be the norm, not the exception anymore.
Great points. In fact, I have got a
Yeah, very good
good
point.
article to share at the end of this. Hopefully, we get to it quickly. So let me take a couple of questions. Unfortunately, we are already at time, and I know perhaps some of you, especially Alok and Sudhi, you are still in your working time, and I guess Andreas, you got to start your day too. So a couple of questions, and then we'll wind up here. So first one is how is this forced digitalization that we've all been kind of forced into? How is that due to the COVID-19 crisis changing the role of the CIO? Do you think that the CIO is suddenly going to become a far more critical? CIOs get criticized a lot. IT gets criticized a lot. CIOs have a very short half life. Do you think their role is going to now become much more central, much more critical? Uh, Alok, let me start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think CIOs are back in the game. I think till a couple of months back, I'm sure all of us have heard this, that the CMO is getting more powerful, or the CDO is becoming more powerful. All the digital investment decisions, tech spending, being driven by business. But I think this situation, this pandemic, has really put the CIOs back into the forefront, because they are the ones who really have to make sure that the entire technology backbone is resilient enough to deal with this kind of a crisis. So I absolutely agree. I think they have a much larger role to play, and the ones who will really stand out will be the ones who really take very affirmative action in dealing with these situations, putting checks and balances, that they're able to deal with this better in future.
Okay. There are a bunch of questions. So unfortunately, I have to take one last question, and I'm going to put it to Andreas. Uh, are there any possibilities that the Agile Manifesto is going to change to suit the new scenario?
So that's a really good question, actually. While Sudipta was mentioning
Right.
his communication, I was just, this very same question popped up in my head. Like, we are talking now in this webinar, for instance, about adaptability, change, optionality, and yet we have a manifesto that hasn't changed in the beginning. So, or at least I hope that we will learn something from the crisis, and begin also adapt our own dog food, right? That change is necessary, and I think that agility should not lead to rigidity in terms of your practices or your management methods, right? And my takeaway to this really good question would be, from time to time, we need to revisit our own context, I'd say, and check if it fits reality, right? So,
Absolutely.
so preaching adaptability and change does not go along if we would not revisit from time to time what we preach, and if it's like up to date or not. So I appreciate that. The last good question.
Excellent. So, in fact, in that context, I wanted to share this article that our CEO sent across just earlier this evening. It's a McKinsey article revisiting agile teams after an abrupt shift to remote. I've shared the link here. It's a freely available article for everyone to download. So, with that, I'm going to actually have to close. We are past the time. I'm going to, uh, you know, you know, probably pass along these questions to all of you, and
Yeah, thank you.
we could potentially respond in a common email to all these questions in response to as a part of the response that we have to our standard webinar follow-up. And I think these might actually give us a base to have more such discussions, because some of the questions that came up are also very interesting. Irrespective, I'd like to thank firstly all of the panelists, Alok and Andreas. Very grateful to you, both of you, to make the time. One of you in the middle of the workday, and Andreas early in the morning for you. And I know you're working late in the night last night. Sudhi and I have been in this for the last at least 10 years now, that we have been in the Kanban and then slowly the Agile and the Scaled Agile journey. And we truly benefit from having thought leaders and friends and professionals such as yourselves to interact with and to learn from. Thank you to all the people who were part of the audience today. Really appreciate yours coming and spending time here. If you'd like to connect with us afterwards, just send us an email at sales@digita.com. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar, maybe not more than a couple of days at the best. And at that time, we will also figure out a way to get to the rest of the questions that came up, and hopefully we can respond to all of them. And of course, if you have any other questions, please do feel free to reach out to us and share those questions with us as well. So with that, Alok, Andreas, Sudhi, thank you very much. It's been a great discussion, and I, for myself, really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you, Alok, Sudhi. It has been a pleasure exchanging with you and see at least some new faces and familiar faces again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.